everyone, welcome to Movement and Me, an initiative that is designed for budding artists across the world who wish to pursue their career in art. I'm your host Niharika, and on this show you will hear artists talk about their lives and the choices they had to make in pursuit of arts. We will also get to use some tips and key learnings from the lives of these artists, along with a detailed discussion on their areas of interest. So quickly hop onto a journey into the world of arts along with us. Today on this show, we have Ms. Nova Bhattacharya. As an artist with an experience of more than 20 years, Nova has been crafting vivid images that invite the viewer on a journey of heart and mind. Integrating improvised movement and gesture, she is inventing a language that needs no translation. Her curiosities and collaborative spirit have led to a body of work widely recognized for its craft, use of space, subtlety of gesture, and accessibility to its audiences. She uses movement, recitation, theater, ritual practice, and mathematically complex rhythms of Bharatanatyam as a baseline for telling new stories and radically reimagining ways to share the vitality of dance. She has been a guest artist with many renowned Canadian companies, including Dance Makers, Toronto Dance Theatre, Peggy Baker Dance Projects, and Compagnie Flack, and founded Nova Dance in 2008. Hi, Nova. Thank you for joining us on this event and show today.
Hi, it's really lovely to be with you this morning.
Oh, thank you so much. You're joining us all the way from Canada, and it's really exciting to have you on board. It's been 2 years since we actually met, and I'm happy that I'm able to do this with you today.
It was around this time, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
Around Christmas.
Well, I'm hoping that next year you and I can get back together and attend another one of those sessions with Geeta ma'am and Aparna. So we're going to get started very quickly because I'm sure everybody, including my audience members, are very curious to know more about you and your journey. So tell us a little bit about where you started with dance, how you started with dance, and what was your inspiration behind all of this?
There's a picture of me as a young girl wearing pink tights and a bodysuit. I think my parents had put me in a ballet class. And then a few years later, Manika Thakkar moved to Toronto from India, and my parents saw her perform, and they basically went backstage and shoved me at her and said, "You should teach her." And she did. She started a school, and I was the first student of that school, which has gone on to train many other dancers since. And so this was all happening in Toronto, Canada. And there was, I always say, even now, dancers are dancing in basements all over the country and in studios. But it was in the basement in Scarborough that I practiced my repertoire and also sometimes cheated. I would go in the basement and I would play the music, and my parents would think I was practicing, but maybe I wasn't really practicing. But I would also, in that same basement, I would go to do my homework and I would play music, and I would be playing the contemporary music of the time. And then I would be dancing instead of doing my homework. But somehow between Bharatanatyam studies and doing that kind of imaginative play, the art form of dance just had taken me completely by the heart and by the mind when I was a young child. So it was the imagination that we use in Bharatanatyam, the possibilities of the body as the universe, all those things were such powerful and compelling concepts for me to dive into. And then the journey was circuitous because when when I was in my teen years, and I said to the guidance counselor at my school that I wanted to be a dancer. And then they said, what kind of dance? And I said, Bharatanatyam. And, there was not a huge swell of support to say, oh, yes, of course, that's what you should do. It was more, oh, well, that's probably not a very viable career. And there wasn't also the sort of conversation about, okay, well, maybe we don't understand what your dance form is, but you could get a fine arts degree. It was just very, no, that's not going to happen, which crushed my spirit. And I sort of said, okay, I'm not going to dance at all. And for about 2 years, I didn't dance. But then I saw a performer, Jai Govinda, who's a Canadian artist, and I was watching him dance, and just the love for dance came back in my belly, and I knew I couldn't not do it. And I went back to it, and I was practicing. I always say I had these 2 cassette tapes from the Marga of my Arangetram. And that was all I had, because I had stopped dancing with my guru, which was an unusual thing to do in Canada or in India, I'm sure. So that was all I had. I had those 8 dances from my Arangetram, and I did them over and over again. And I pulled them apart, and I dove into things about them, and I put them aside, and then I came back to them. And so that, I mean, in terms of who I am as a dancer, that's what made me as a dancer. And then in terms of where I am now and the artistic director of a company, that was also this journey of, when I initially didn't think it was possible to work in the arts, I had a job in the investment industry. And then I left that behind, and I started working at an arts service organization. And so even then I was part-time dancing, part-time working at the organization. But then, because I was now again in the world of dance instead of in the world of business, I was seeing so many people who were, just being courageous and finding a way to make dance the way they made a living. And then I thought, okay, I can do this too. And I dove into that. So perseverance and grit, and some incredible support along the way from other artists and other people who believed in me and believed in my work, and helped me to get to the place I am at today.
Okay, so I have a lot of things that I want to ask you based on this little bit of information on your journey. But I'm going to get started with the first thing that I noticed about your technique, and also because I've sort of watched you perform as well. There's something unique about your technique, something that is different from the way Bharatanatyam, or even the repertoire of Bharatanatyam is performed. What would you call your technique? Is there a name that you will add it to it? And where did you find the inspiration to it? And if you could tell us a little bit about what your technique involves, then it would be great for the audience as well.
So these days, the company artists have started referring to it as the Nova Dance technique. So I'm going with it and saying, okay, we can call it that. And I mean, what inspired it really, it's interesting. This period of the pandemic has been making me reflect on that a lot, because there have been a lot of similarities to the conditions that we're living under right now to what I felt I was living as an artist when I was first creating these ideas. So, right now, when people have gone into lockdown and they're in isolation and they're in their spaces and activity is limited, and there's sort of this vacuum because we can't connect with people. And similarly, because I left the Bharatanatyam world in some ways, and the Indian dance world, so I was in this vacuum and isolation of often being the only South Asian person in a room, the only Bharatanatyam dancer in a room. And I was in my own room trying to make dance. And I would often find, like, the act of solo dance and going to a studio can be so lonely, and sometimes not even that creatively invigorating, because you go to the studio and then the stress of what you're going to do there can overwhelm. Whereas I was living in all these strange apartments at the time, and being in small confined spaces, and then still finding ways to work through dance. Just like limitations create so many possibilities. And I, rock and roll has always been a huge influence in my work, and listening to rock and roll and taking the lyrics and applying the same kind of ideas we do with Abhinaya, but to this whole different kind of language and different kind of poetry, taking the movement of Bharatanatyam and taking the, well, again, because I was in small, strange apartments with other neighbors, I was working with taking taking the sound of the footwork off of the movement, and then seeing what the possibilities were for the movement that way. And yeah, and improvisation is a really big part of my work. And so, I guess the principal initial thing I was trying, because when we train in Bharatanatyam, many of us, it's really, again, these two separate pathways of this is the Abhinaya and this is the abstract dance. And I just wanted those two things to always be overlapping and in the same place. That why can't a Kitatakarikita thom gesture have the same meaning as doing something like this? Like, how can we find ways to bring meaning to movement, and just the power of movement to speak to many people in a way that words can't. So all those things just inspired me to keep playing and exploring and finding ways to use the tools that a dancer has to communicate to an audience in different ways.
That is quite informative. And remembering and recalling your technique, I do remember the kind of movements that you used and how you tried and combined gestures with Abhinaya, and also performed it on very interesting pieces of music. But one thing that actually catches my attention, and I really think it's important for us to talk about, is what kind of struggles did you go through when you sort of stopped going to your guru to learn Bharatanatyam, and how did you manage to cope with it? Because as a dancer and as someone who's interested in the research aspect of dance, I'm also struggling with wanting to perform, but also not wanting to be a performer, in the broader sense of the word. I don't want to keep doing performances, but I do want to perform in my own space. But how, and how can we strike the balance, and what are the struggles that one faces when they decide that they don't want to pursue a regular dance class setup with a guru or under a guru? And how can one cope with those challenges?
That's a really big question, and I've been for a couple of years now discussing it with the dancers that come to Nova Dance for a variety of projects. And we have been saying, we've been referring to it as guru trauma, and that it's such a complex relationship that, we love them. They are the ones that inspire and arouse those first stirrings of how to become a dance artist, and they are our dance parents. And then how do we make choices of our own? How do we find ways to bring our own artistry to the surface? How can we travel in a direction that that veers off of certain prescribed paths and still have integrity and love and commitment to the art form that we trained in? And we joke about going over to the dark side, but you can always but the dark side is actually where all the exciting new ideas are. So in terms of coping, I mean, it was difficult. It was difficult. I felt very much that I was a renegade, that I was excised from a community that was supposed to be, well, I mean, that's the thing. These words, community and industry, it's all, we can use the words, but what do they really mean? And so, yeah, so I was in that vacuum. And then that was part of why the I made certain choices that I did where I was working with artists like Peggy Baker and Jose Navas because I wanted to find ways to keep dancing, but I wasn't interested in going to India and finding another guru and learning another Margot. That didn't feel like the right path for me. It felt like I would just be repeating certain things that I already knew weren't the way I needed to work. And I was just really interested in saying, okay, yes, I've studied this art form. I live in this country. I want to collaborate with artists here. I want to find my own path. And then eventually, because of the work I was doing, and then again, I mentioned some incredible supports I've had along the way. And Sudha Kandwani, who was producing a festival in Canada called the Kalanidhi Dance Festival, in 1994, she invited me to perform. And it was a risky move that she took at that point to invite me to perform, even though everybody knew I was, without a teacher and doing my own thing. And then a few times she presented me in her festival, and the first time it was doing classical repertoire, and then she started presenting my contemporary work. And then there was this one year I had done a work called Maskura, and it was just this real turning point where some of the seniors in the community who previously had been perhaps keeping me at arm's length they recognized what was in the work. And then some of the relationships started to repair. So I don't know if I've answered your question about how I coped with it. I think it was really just having complete and unshakable faith in artistic practice, and knowing that if you keep doing your work with integrity, that there's always going to be a spectrum of response to your work, and that when people are ready to come to your work, or when people are ready to embrace your work, that moment will happen.
That does give us some insights on how we can proceed with it if we find ourselves in a puddle like that. But I think it's definitely a huge challenge for someone who's living it in the moment that they are, to be able to find their path and continue to follow it. And you're absolutely right. When you maybe decide to do something of your own, the word community and the word industries begins to change its meaning, because you suddenly become shunned, and you're not part of the same community, again putting the word in quotes. And it's difficult to find your space in such a scenario and an event. uh, you also, taking a cue from that, you also talk a lot about inclusion and diversity, and all of these words play a huge role in you, and I've seen that you advocate for inclusion a lot. So can you talk a little bit about what these words mean for you, diversity, inclusion, and why you think it's important for us to address them and put them in the perspective and context of dance? Maybe also touch upon particularly the Indian classical dance forms.
Okay. Well, I mean, diversity is a term that I have always loved. I mean, I have always been fascinated by watching different bodies mastering the same movement, or like when you have a diversity of artists in the room, the ideas that come, and like in all walks of life, whether it's the economy, or politics, or healthcare, or like just in everything, we know that diversity is a good thing. The more different perspectives there are, the richer the conversation is, the more things that are considered. And so, in dance, as I said earlier, like that bringing a diversity of artists to the work that you're doing can only serve to make it richer. So I live in Toronto. It has often been called the most multicultural city in the world. And so we have a great deal of diversity here. And when I was growing up as a young dancer, I feel like my career was built dancing at at the days. So Filipino National Day, Indonesian this day, India's Independence Day, like all those days when cultural communities were coming together to celebrate something, they always wanted dance to be a part of it. So, I mean, I remember my dad would take me to perform at some, church basement where the Indonesian community was meeting. And I would, like, as a young child, be like, why do they want Indian dance at their thing? But it was because they wanted dance, and they knew that there was a connection with Indian dance to the culture of Indonesia and those kinds of things. So yes, so diversity is a wonderful word. And then you have the realities of cultural hegemony and culturally dominant artistic expression. And even in a city like Toronto, the organizations that get the lion's share of the funding have, and certainly, 10, 20 years ago, they were able to stay in a very narrow world. So whether it was the ballet or the orchestra, like everybody could just sort of say, this is what we do, and this is fine art. And those, so it's important for a city to reflect its citizens. So that's why diversity is important. And I have always been an active participant in civic life, and I spent 6 years as the president of the Toronto Arts Council, which is a municipal funding body here. And I'm very proud of the fact that while I was the president of that organization was when the organization created an equity framework, which applied not only to the organization and its hiring practices and how it existed as an organization. The framework also addressed how funding is dispersed to artists and arts organizations. And that, so it's important, as I said, because the artistic work of a city also needs to reflect the people that live there. And what was really interesting at the Toronto Arts Council is because of the demographic of Toronto, it looked like everything was fine because there were a lot of artists who were coming forward and being supported, and yet there wasn't an official framework in place that would ensure that equitable practices were in place to make sure that historic inequities were addressed, or artists who had previously been marginalized were able to come into the center. So, and there's still a lot of work to be done. Just having a framework doesn't solve the problems, but having a framework is an important starting point. So diversity, and also, like, people, there's equity, there's diversity, there's inclusion, and all these terms individually are important. And yet when they become part of the jargon, they can lose their impact. And at the end of the day, equity, diversity, and inclusion all still just come down to human rights. That, as that these are the rights that every individual should have, and that every artist should be able to be seen in the context that they create for themselves. So now I feel I'm rambling a little bit, but I hope I've answered a little bit your question.
You've more than answered the question, but so I just want to reiterate something that you said, which caught my attention, and I think it's important for us to remember. The inclusion and diversity are things that are part of human rights of any being on this earth, because at the end of the day, though, they are very much part of our lifestyle and who we are. Because of course, diversity exists based on which culture you belong to, but just disregarding a community because they are different from yours is not the solution, and definitely makes you wonder where the human rights are. What lines do you draw and what lines do you cross as a human being when you start marginalizing communities and start treating them differently. So thank you for all of that, and I'm glad that you were able to make a difference in the by being the president of the Arts Council, which acts as the municipal corporation. It's actually a huge huge step in the right direction. And I hope that many more people who have these positions, eminent positions, are able to make the impact that you were able to in your tenure, during your tenure. It's important. I have been talking to a lot of people myself, and there's this lady who I recently interviewed, Anita Vijay, who also works in the United States, who was born in Canada, who talks a little bit about this issue of, inclusion in within our own Indian communities, and how classical community treats and um, includes people in their journeys, and what does it do to artists who decide to take their own or choose their own paths. So these are things and conversations that need to be had and definitely need to be brought out there just for people to engage with. Thank you all for tuning into Movement and Me, an initiative that is designed for budding artists across the world. To continue receiving notifications on our latest episode, please subscribe to our YouTube channel Natya Mandalam or look us up on Apple Podcasts or Spotify for more information. I'm your host Niharika, and I'll see you all next time.